3 days had passed since the escape from Vescari. Stationed in Jinho's ship was now docked at a Galactic Concord outpost where they could finally rest. The story of what had happened had spread across dozens of systems, and the response had been larger than anyone expected. News networks were calling it the Vescari incident, and politicians from 100 worlds were suddenly very interested in what happened in neutral space. Jinho had spent most of those 3 days giving interviews and answering questions from officials who wanted to understand why he had done what he did. His answer was always the same, and it confused many of the alien species who heard it. He said that he could not watch someone suffer and do nothing about it. He said that walking away would have cost him something more valuable than credits or safety. The concept seemed simple to humans, but many other species struggled to understand why he would risk everything for a stranger. Salith had recovered much of her strength now that the collar was no longer draining her energy. Her skin glowed with a soft blue light that filled whatever room she entered with gentle warmth. She had been examined by medical staff who confirmed that she would make a full physical recovery, but the deeper wounds were harder to measure and would take much longer to heal. She spent hours sitting by the viewport of Jinho's ship and watching the stars drift past. Sharon would bring her food and sit with her in comfortable silence because some hurts did not need words. Jinho found them there one evening and asked if he could join them. Salith nodded and made room for him on the small bench that faced the window. For a long time, none of them spoke, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the ship's life support systems. Finally, Salith asked the question that had been burning inside her since the moment he grabbed her hand at the auction. She wanted to know what he expected from her in return for what he had done. Jinho looked confused and asked her what she meant. Salith explained that in her experience, nothing was ever free. Every kindness came with a price, and every rescue came with chains that were just harder to see. She had been given hope before, only to discover that her saviors wanted things from her that were no different from what her owners had demanded. Jinho was quiet for a moment, and then he shook his head slowly. He told her that he expected nothing from her except whatever she chose to give freely. He said that she did not owe him her labor or her company or her gratitude or anything else. She was free now, and that meant she got to decide what her life would look like from this point forward. Salith did not believe him at first, because his words went against everything she had learned during her years of captivity. But she could feel his emotions through her restored empathic abilities, and she could sense no deception in him. He meant exactly what he said, and the truth of it made her chest ache in ways she could not explain. Sharon added that humans had a complicated history with slavery. She said that their species had done terrible things to each other for thousands of years, but they had also fought and died to end those systems, and they had made promises to themselves that they would never accept such things again. Those promises did not just apply to other humans. They applied to anyone who was suffering under the control of others. Salith listened and tried to understand these strange beings who seemed to carry such conviction in their hearts. She asked what would happen to her now and where she would go. Jinho said that the Concord was arranging transport for any refugees who wanted to return to their home worlds. If she had family among the Varani, they could help her find them. But he also said that she was welcome to stay with them if she preferred. They could always use another set of hands on the ship, and she had proven herself resourceful during their escape. It was her choice and only her choice. Salith felt the weight of that freedom settle onto her shoulders like a garment she had forgotten how to wear. She had not made a real choice about her own life in so many years that the ability to do so felt almost frightening. But there was something about these humans that made her want to stay close to them. She wanted to understand them better and learn how beings could care so deeply about strangers. She told Jinho that she would stay for now if the offer was genuine. He smiled and said that it was absolutely genuine and that Sharon would be happy to have someone else to talk to besides him. Sharon laughed and said that Salith had no idea what she was getting into by agreeing to live with Jinho's terrible jokes. The three of them sat together and watched the stars while something new began to form between them. It was not quite friendship yet, but it was the foundation on which friendship could be built. Meanwhile, the ripples from the Veskari incident continued to spread across the galaxy. Other human ships had begun patrolling near stations where slave auctions were known to take place. They did not attack or threaten anyone, but their presence was enough to make slavers nervous. The message was clear and simple. Humans were watching now, and no one knew what they might do if they saw something they did not like. Some species called them unpredictable and dangerous. Others called them naive and foolish for caring about things that did not affect their own survival. But a growing number of beings across the galaxy were starting to ask different questions if humans would risk everything for a stranger. Then what did that say about the capacity for compassion in the universe? If one species could decide that certain things were simply unacceptable, then could others make that same choice? The Veskari orbital market continued to operate, but its auction attendance had dropped significantly. Too many buyers were afraid that a human might be watching and that their purchase might draw unwanted attention. It was not the end of slavery in the galaxy, but it was a crack in a system that had seemed permanent and unshakable, and cracks had a way of spreading once they started. Sela thought about all of this as she sat between her new companions and felt their warmth beside her. She thought about the human who had thrown away everything just because he could not stand to watch her suffer. She thought about what it meant to be seen as a person rather than a possession. And she thought about the future that was now open to her for the first time and longer than she could remember. The stars outside the window seemed brighter than they ever had before, and somewhere in the darkness there were other beings in chains who might one day feel this same freedom, because humans had decided that suffering was not something they could ignore. And once humans decided something, it seemed that nothing in the galaxy could make them change their minds. The ship burst out of the maintenance docks and into the open space around Veskari Station, with alarms blaring from every console. Sharon's hands flew across the controls as she pushed their old vessel harder than it was designed to go behind. Them three security ships were already launching from the station, and their weapons were powering up. Jinho dropped into the pilot's seat beside his partner and took over navigation while she handled the engines. They had flown together for years, and they moved like two parts of the same machine without needing to speak. Salith watched them from her seat and felt something she had not experienced since her capture so long ago. She felt hope mixed with fear and determination, flowing from both humans like heat from a star. Their emotions were so different from the cold greed and casual cruelty she had sensed from the beings at the auction. These two were terrified, but they were not giving up, and that combination was something she had never encountered before. A voice crackled over the communication system, and Jinho recognized the cold tones of Station Master Vrel. The Drovian demanded that they surrender immediately and return the stolen property to its rightful owner. He warned them that resistance would result in their ship being destroyed and their bodies left to float in the void. Jinho opened a channel to respond, but instead of speaking to Vrel, he broadcast on a frequency that he knew would reach far beyond the station. He identified himself and his ship, and he described exactly what was happening at the Veskari orbital market. He told anyone listening about the slave auctions and the being sold like cargo, and the suffering that was considered entertainment. He said that the Galactic Concord pretended these things did not happen because Veskari was in neutral space beyond their laws. But humans did not accept that excuse, because suffering did not care about borders or jurisdictions. The security ships were getting closer, and their weapons would be in range. Within minutes, Sharon told Jinho that she hoped his broadcast was doing something useful, because they could not outrun these ships. Their vessel was built for hauling cargo, not for combat or escape from military-grade pursuit craft. Jinho kept broadcasting and described the Varani female he had rescued from the auction platform. He explained what the collar around her neck was doing to her mind and body. He asked anyone listening if this was acceptable and if the galaxy was really going to pretend it was not happening. The communication system began receiving incoming signals from sources scattered across nearby space. One by one, other ships began responding to his broadcast with messages of support and outrage. Most of them were too far away to help, but their voices joined his in calling out what was happening at Veskari. Then 3 signals came through that were different from the rest. They were human ships, and they were not far away at all. The first was a mining vessel called the Iron Promise that was operating in an asteroid field, just 2 systems away. The captain said that his crew had heard the broadcast and they were changing course immediately. The second was a passenger transport named the Soldan that was carrying colonists to a new settlement. Her pilot announced that they would arrive within the hour, and they were not coming alone. The third signal came from a ship that Jinho did not recognize, but the voice that spoke was calm and hard. The speaker identified himself as Commander Bae Sejun of the Earth Defense Cooperative, Patrol Vessel Vigilant. He informed Station Master Vrel that any attack on a human civilian ship would be considered an act of war against Earth and her allies. The security ships that had been closing in suddenly slowed their approach. Vrel's voice came over the communication system again, and this time his confidence had cracked around the edges. He demanded to know why humans were interfering in a lawful commercial matter. He insisted that the Varani female was legally purchased property and that Jinho had committed theft. Commander Bae responded in a voice that carried no emotion except cold certainty. He said that humans did not recognize the ownership of sentient beings under any circumstances. He said that this was not a commercial dispute but a rescue operation. He said that the security ships had 30 seconds to withdraw, or they would learn exactly how seriously humans took this principle. The seconds ticked by, and Jinho watched the security ships on his display. He could see them hovering at the edge of weapons range as their commanders tried to decide what to do. Vrel was screaming over the communication channel about contracts and property rights and the laws of neutral space. But no one was listening to him anymore, because everyone was waiting to see what the humans would do. The security ships finally turned and headed back toward the station. Vrel announced that this matter was not over and that humans would regret their interference. But his threats sounded hollow now that his ships had retreated. Sharon let out a breath she had been holding and slumped back in her seat. She told Jinho that he was absolutely insane and that she could not believe his plan had actually worked. Jinho admitted that he had not really had a plan beyond refusing to let something terrible happen sometimes. That was enough to start something bigger than any individual could create alone. Salith stood from her seat and walked to stand between the 2 humans. The collar on her neck was still glowing with the suppression field that caused her constant pain. Sharon turned and looked at the device with anger in her eyes. She told Salith to sit down and hold still because she was going to figure out how to remove that thing. The collar was designed to be impossible to remove without the proper codes, but Sharon had spent her whole life taking apart things that were supposed to be impossible. She retrieved a toolkit from the storage compartment and knelt beside Salith. Her fingers moved carefully across the collar's surface as she searched for weaknesses in its construction. Jinho watched the approaching ships on his display and felt something settle in his chest. They had done something that should have been impossible, and they had survived. But more than that, they had reminded the galaxy that some beings would not accept cruelty just because it was legal or convenient to call around. Salith's neck made a clicking sound and then went dark. Sharon lifted it away and tossed it across the cabin with disgust written on her face. Salith gasped as the suppression field released its hold on her mind. Her skin began to glow brighter than it had in years, and tears ran down her cheeks. She could feel everything now without the pain and the numbing weight that had crushed her for so long. She could feel Sharon's satisfaction and Jinho's relief and underneath everything else, she could feel something that made her weep. She could feel that these strangers actually cared about her as a person, not as property or a prize or a tool to be used. They saw her as someone who mattered, and that feeling was more overwhelming than anything the caller had ever done to her. The maintenance corridors of Vescari Station were dark and filled with pipes and cables that seemed to stretch in every direction like the veins of some massive creature. Jinho kept moving forward with the Varani female at his side, even though he had no idea where he was going. The station's layout was unfamiliar to him, and the alarms that echoed through the metal walls made it hard to think clearly. Behind them, he could hear the sounds of pursuit as security teams spread out to search for the human who had stolen valuable property from their most important auction. The Varani female suddenly pulled on his arm and pointed toward a narrow passage that branched off to their left. Jinho asked her how she knew which way to go, and she explained that she could feel the emotions of the beings around them. Most of the station's population was gathered near the main corridors, where the excitement of the chase had drawn curious crowds. But the path she was pointing toward felt empty and cold, with no emotional signatures for her to detect. Jinho trusted her judgment and followed her into the smaller passage that was barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. He finally asked her name as they moved through the darkness, and she told him that she was called Salith. It was a beautiful name that seemed to fit the soft glow of her skin, even though that glow was fading more with each passing minute. The collar around her neck was designed to suppress her abilities and cause pain whenever she tried to use them too much, but she had been pushing herself to help them escape, and the cost was becoming visible in the way she trembled with each step. Jinho told her that she needed to stop using her powers before the collar did permanent damage to her mind. Salith shook her head and said that finding their way out was more important than protecting herself. She had spent years as a slave, and she had learned that her own well-being was never the priority. Jinho stopped walking and turned to face her in the dim light of the corridor. He told her that things were different now, and that her safety mattered just as much as reaching his ship. Salith stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she did not understand. No one had ever said such words to her before, and she did not know how to respond to them. The sound of boots on metal interrupted their moment, and Jinho pulled her into a small alcove as a patrol passed by on a parallel corridor. They pressed against the wall and barely breathed until the footsteps faded into the distance. Sharon's voice came through his earpiece, and she told him that she had accessed a partial map of the station's ventilation system. She guided them through a series of turns that brought them closer to the docking bay where their ship was waiting. But she also warned him that station security had placed guards at every entrance to the docks. They knew that the human would try to reach his vessel, and they were not going to make it easy for him. Jinho asked if there was any other way in, and Sharon said that there was one possibility, but it was not a good one. The maintenance crews used a separate entrance for servicing the ships, and that entrance was less heavily guarded, but it required passing through a section of the station that was controlled by the dock workers rather than station security. Those workers were not loyal to anyone except themselves, and their willingness to help would depend entirely on how they felt about what was happening. Jinho told Sharon to send him the route, and he would take his chances with the dock workers. They moved through more corridors and climbed through access hatches that were barely large enough for Jinho's shoulders. Salith was more flexible and moved through the tight spaces with a grace that her weakened body should not have been able to manage. She told him that Varani were naturally agile because their homeworld had dense forests where they evolved to move through tangled branches. Jinho filed this information away and focused on getting them to the maintenance entrance that Sharon had identified. They emerged from a final hatch into a loading area where several aliens were sorting cargo containers. One of them was a Thalari named Mikos, who looked up from his work as the human and the Varani stumbled into his workspace. Jinho expected the worker to call for security or attack them or do any of the dozen. hostile things that would make sense in this situation. But Mikos just looked at them for a long moment and then looked at the collar around Salith's neck. Something passed across his face that might have been memory or pain or both. He asked Jinho if he was the human who had disrupted the auction, and Jinho admitted that he was. Mikos nodded slowly and said that he had heard the commotion over the station's communication system. The whole station was talking about the crazy human who had grabbed a slave and run off the platform as if he had no idea how things worked in this place. Jinho tensed because he could not tell if Mikos was going to help them or turn them in. The Thalari seemed to be thinking carefully about what to do, and the seconds stretched out painfully long. Finally, Mikos pointed toward a service passage on the far side of the loading area. He said that the passage led directly to the maintenance docks and that security had not thought to guard it yet. He told them to move quickly because he could not protect them if someone came to check on his section. Jinho thanked him and started toward the passage, but he stopped when Salith did not follow immediately. She was looking at Mikos with an expression that mixed confusion with something deeper. She asked him why he was helping them when the station would punish him severely if they discovered what he had done. Mikos did not answer right away, and when he spoke his voice was heavy with old wounds. He said that he had watched too many beings walk through these corridors in chains over the years. He said that he had learned to look away and pretend it was not happening because that was the only way to survive in a place like this. But sometimes a person reached a point where looking away became more painful than the consequences of taking action. He told him to go before he changed his mind and remembered why he had spent so long staying out of trouble. Jinho grabbed Salith's hand and pulled her toward the passage as Mikos turned back to his cargo, as if nothing had happened. They ran through the narrow corridor and emerged into the maintenance docks where Jinho's battered cargo ship was waiting exactly where he had left it. Sharon appeared at the top of the loading ramp with a weapon in her hand and relief written across her face. She told them to get inside because she had been monitoring security channels and they were running out of time. Station Master Vrel had issued orders to lock down all departures until the stolen property was recovered. Jinho helped Salith up the ramp and told Sharon to start the engines immediately. They were leaving this station whether anyone gave them permission or not. Sharon disappeared into the ship, and a moment later Jinho felt the familiar vibration of the engines coming to life. He secured the loading ramp and made his way to the cockpit where Salith had already strapped herself into one of the passenger seats. Through the viewport he could see security vehicles converging on their position, but the ship was already lifting off the deck and turning toward the station's exit. They were going to make it out of the docks. At least what happened after that was still very much uncertain. The auction hall had gone completely quiet after Jinho called out his bid, and every eye in the room turned to look at the human who had dared to challenge. Torvak Gen, the Kasori merchant, studied Jinho with all four of his dark eyes, and his expression showed more curiosity than anger at first. Torvak had never lost an auction before, and he had certainly never been challenged by a species as young and insignificant as humans. He raised his hand and called out a higher number without any hesitation because credits meant nothing to someone of his wealth. Jinho felt his heart pounding in his chest as he calculated how much he could possibly offer. His ship was worth something, but it was old and battered from years of hard travel through dangerous space. He had some savings, but they were meant to keep him and Sharin alive through the lean months between contracts. None of it would be enough to match what Torvak could spend without even blinking, but Jinho raised his hand again, anyway, and named a price that made several beings in the crowd gasp out loud. He was offering everything he had, including his ship and his cargo, and every credit in his account. Sharon's voice crackled in his ear, and she demanded to know what he was doing because he had just bet their entire lives on this auction. Jinho told her that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that she should trust him, even though he did not trust himself at this moment. The auctioneer Kezeth looked at Jinho with a mixture of amusement and suspicion in his reptilian eyes. He asked if the human could actually pay such an amount or if this was some kind of joke. Jinho pulled out his trading credentials and showed them to the nearest station official, who scanned them and confirmed that his accounts were real. The official noted that the human's total assets would just barely cover his current bid if he liquidated everything immediately. Torvak laughed at this, and the sound was cold and sharp like breaking glass. He called out another bid that was twice what Jinho had offered, and he did it as casually as ordering a drink. The crowd murmured in appreciation because this was turning into entertainment for them. Two beings fighting over a slave was always more interesting than a simple transaction. Jinho stared at the platform where the Varani female was watching him with something that might have been hope in her tired eyes. He could not match Torvak's wealth, and he could not win this auction through credits alone. But humans had not survived and spread across the galaxy by playing fair or following the rules that others set for them. Jinho raised his hand one more time and named a price so high that it made no sense at all. He said that he would pay 10 times what Torvak had offered, and that he would put up his ship as guarantee until the funds transferred. Kazath's eyes narrowed because no cargo hauler had that kind of money, and everyone in the room knew it. The auctioneer demanded proof of funds before accepting such a ridiculous bid. Jinho smiled and said that his family had extensive holdings on Earth that would cover the amount easily. He just needed a few hours to arrange the transfer. From the Sol system, this was a complete lie, but Jinho delivered it with the confidence of someone who had been bluffing his way through dangerous situations for years. Torvak did not believe him and made this clear by demanding that the station verify the human's claims immediately. The official tried to access financial records from Earth, but the Sol system's networks were notoriously difficult for outside species to navigate. Human bureaucracy was amazed that even the most advanced civilizations struggled to understand. The official finally admitted that verification would take several hours at minimum due to translation protocols and security clearances. Kazath was faced with a choice because the auction could not simply stop while they waited for confirmation. He announced that the bidding would continue and that the human's bid would be held pending verification. Torvak immediately raised his offer again, and this time he added a threat along with his credits. He said that anyone who interfered with his purchase would regret it deeply and permanently. The message was clear enough that several other bidders who had been considering joining the auction quickly changed their minds. Jinho knew that his bluff had failed and that he had run out of moves that made any kind of sense, but he also knew something that Torvak and Kazath and everyone else in this room did not understand about humans. They did not give up just because the situation was impossible. They did not stop fighting just because they were certain to lose. Jinho looked at the platform one more time and met the eyes of the Varani female who was still watching him. She could feel his emotions, and she knew that he was afraid and desperate and completely out of options. But she could also feel something else underneath all of that fear. She could feel that he had already decided what he was going to do. Next, Jinho moved before anyone could react because humans were faster than most species expected them to be. He pushed through the crowd and vaulted onto the auction platform in one smooth motion that years of loading cargo had made possible. Keza stumbled backward in shock, and the guards were too surprised to stop what was happening. Jinho reached the Varani female and grabbed her hand and told her to run. She stared at him for one heartbeat, as if she could not believe what was happening. Then, something in her expression changed, and she squeezed his hand and nodded. They ran together toward the back of the platform, where a service door led into the station's maintenance corridors. Behind them, the auction hall erupted into chaos as Torvak screamed for the guards to stop them. The Kasori's voice was filled with a rage that made the Varani female stumble because she could feel every bit of his fury through her empathic senses. Jinho caught her and kept her moving because stopping now would mean death for both of them. They crashed through the service door and into the dimly lit corridor beyond alarms began to sound throughout the station, and Jinho knew that they had only minutes before every security force on. The Viscari would be hunting them. Sharin was shouting in his ear and asking what he had done and demanding to know if he had lost his mind. Jinho told her to have the ship ready because they were coming in hot and they would not have time for anything but a fast escape. The Varani female was struggling to keep up because the collar around her neck was draining her strength with every step. Jinho slowed down just enough to wrap his arm around her waist and help her forward. She looked at him with those dim glowing eyes and asked him why he was doing this. Why would a stranger destroy his life for someone he had never met before today? Jinho did not have time to explain everything, but he gave her the only answer that mattered. He told her that watching them sell her was something he could not do, and walking away while she suffered was something he would not do. The Varani female did not respond, but Jinho felt her grip on his hand tighten as they ran deeper into the station. Park Jinho had never meant to stop at the Viscari orbital market, but his ship had given him no choice in the matter. The engine had started making sounds that no engine should ever make, and the navigation system kept flickering between destinations that were thousands of light years apart from each other. He needed parts, and he needed them fast before he was left floating dead in the empty space between star systems. The Viscari market was not a place where honest traders came to do business, but it was the only station within range of his failing vessel. Jinho docked his ship and paid the ridiculous fee that the station authority demanded just for the privilege of breathing their recycled air. His business partner Yun Sharon stayed behind to watch their cargo while he went out to find the components they needed to get moving again. The station was exactly what he had expected from the stories he had heard over the years. Every corridor was filled with beings from dozens of different species, and most of them looked like they would sell their own families for the right price. Jinho kept his head down and moved through the crowds with purpose, because looking lost in a place like this was the fastest way to become a target. He found a parts dealer on the 3rd level and managed to negotiate a fair enough price for a replacement power coupling. The Drovian merchant had tried to charge him triple the standard rate, but Jinho had been trading long enough to know when someone was testing him. With the part secured in his pack, he started making his way back toward the docks, but that was when he heard the noise. It was a sound unlike anything else on the station, and it cut through all the chatter and machinery. Like a blade through soft fabric, someone was crying out in pain or fear or both, and the sound pulled at something deep inside his chest. Jinho knew that he should keep walking because this was not his business, and this was not his station, and these were not his people. But his feet carried him toward the sound anyway, as if they had decided to ignore what his brain was telling them to do. He turned a corner and found himself standing at the edge of a large open space that was filled with hundreds of spectators. They were all facing a raised platform at the center of the room, where bright lights shone down on a row of figures standing in chains. Jinho felt his stomach turn cold as he realized what he was looking at. This was a slave auction, and the beings on that platform were being sold like cargo to whoever offered the highest bid. He had heard rumors that such things still happened in the lawless regions of space, but he had never seen it with his own eyes until this moment. Most of the slaves were species he did not recognize, but one figure near the end of the row made him stop breathing for a long second. She was Varani, and he knew this because of the soft glow that came from her pale blue skin. The Varani were famous throughout the galaxy for their beauty and their empathic abilities, which allowed them to sense and share the emotions of those around them. This female was young, and her glow was so dim that it was barely visible against the harsh lights of the platform. Her eyes stared at nothing, and her body was thin in a way that spoke of long hunger and longer suffering. A collar wrapped around her neck, and Jinho knew enough about such devices to understand that it was suppressing her abilities and causing her constant pain. The auctioneer was a Drovian named Kezeth, who stood at the front of the platform with a smile that showed too many teeth. He was describing the Varani female to the crowd with words that made Jinho want to put his fist through the alien's face. Kezeth explained that Varani made excellent companions because their empathic nature meant they could feel everything their owners felt. He said that some buyers enjoyed this feature because it meant the slave would experience their pleasure and their anger in equal measure. The crowd laughed at this, and several beings raised their hands to begin the bidding. Jinho watched as a wealthy Kasori merchant named Torvak again made offer after offer. With a hungry look in his 4 eyes, the Kasori were known for their cruelty and their vast collections of rare and beautiful things from across the galaxy. Torvak clearly intended to add the Varani female to his collection, and the thought of what would happen to her made Jinho's blood burn hot. The female on the platform flinched each time a new bid was called out, and Jinho realized that she could feel the emotions of everyone in the room. She was drowning in their greed and their lust and their complete lack of care for her suffering. She could feel that none of them saw her as a person, and that knowledge was written in the tears that ran down her glowing cheeks. Jinho reached for his communicator and opened the channel to Sharon back on their ship. His partner answered immediately and asked if he had found the parts they needed. Jinho told her that he had found something else, and that she needed to prepare the ship for a fast departure. Sharon asked what was happening, and her voice carried the worry that she always felt when Jinho got that particular tone in his voice. He told her about the auction and about the Varani female and about what he was thinking of doing. Sharon was silent for a long moment, and then she told him that they did not have the credits and that they could not afford to make enemies in a place like this. She reminded him that they had a cargo to deliver and contracts to fulfill, and a life that depended on them not doing anything. Stupid Jinho knew that everything she said was true and reasonable and correct, but he also knew that he could not walk away from this room and live with himself afterward. He told Sharon to get the engines ready, because they were going to need them very soon. Then he walked forward through the crowd toward the bidding floor, where Torvak again was about to claim his prize. The Varani female lifted her head as Jinho approached, and her dim eyes found his face in the crowd for just a moment. Something flickered in her expression, and Jinho realized that she could feel his emotions. Too, she could feel his anger and his fear, and underneath both of those things, she could feel something that she had not felt in a very long time. She could feel that someone in this room actually cared about what happened to her. Jinho raised his hand and called out a bid that made the entire crowd fall silent in surprise. He had no idea how he was going to pay for it, and he had no plan for what would come next. But he knew one thing with perfect certainty as he stared up at that platform. He was not going to let them take her.